Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 1, The Nature of Conflict. We'll now start with the outline of the chapter and then we'll go into the chapters itself. So here's the chapter outline. We'll be looking at interpersonal conflict, how they are dependent on the communication we have with one another. We'll also have a discussion of what conflict means and why do we study conflict. We'll also be discussing several ways of preventing destructive conflict and how we can recognize those types of conflict. And finally, we'll wrap up the chapter by looking at opportunities that you have when you are in a conflict. So first off, interpersonal conflicts always depend on interpersonal communication. Reason because when there is a conflict, communication is the medium between the conflict participants, or rather parties. So the communication can be in face-to-face, or in a written context, or through technology. So when communication begins, it can transform the conflict, or sometimes the lack of communication can also help to facilitate or worsen the conflict, which we'll look at in today's chapter as well as subsequent chapters. For conflict participants or parties to communicate, what they do essentially is to generate a common or shared meaning, an understanding of what they perceive to be the issue or conflict. And perception is important because in the next couple chapters, or rather the next couple pages, we'll see how perception is key in helping to shape not just what the conflict is, but how the conflict can be managed. And parties seek to communicate reason because to solve the problem or the problems. And in this case, the issue at hand, what do they perceive to be a point of tension? And they communicate as well as a way to resolve or to preserve their relationship so that they can accomplish the same goals that they both or multiple parties desire to achieve together. So ultimately, the purpose of communication in conflict is that it helps the communicator or the parties involved to help to better understand the situation, as well as to help to manage how the conflict continues or gets resolved. But before we look at that, we should go to the next page to have a better understanding of what conflict means and what the definition we will adopt for this book as well as for this course. So conflict, what does conflict mean? The very definition that we use is right on the top of this slide. It's an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals or scarce resources and interference from others in achieving their goals. So here are a few key words in this very, very long definition. There is an expressed struggle, is the first term that we see. It's an expressed struggle because it is obvious to the parties involved. It's something that they are talking about, or probably they sense, and then that brought them to come together to talk about. So for example, say you live in a home with one other sibling. Your sibling wants to borrow the family car to go to watch a movie with his friends, for example, but you would like to borrow the family car to get some groceries, also pretty much the same time this evening. So what happens? Who gets to use the family car? So there's an express struggle because there's only one car, but you and your brother want to use the car. So that brings us to the next term that's important in this definition, is that there are at least two interdependent parties right here. Oops. At least two interdependent parties, and it can be more than two, but to simplify things, there are at least two parties involved. And the key word here really is interdependence. And why is that so? Why is interdependence the important word here? Because the two parties need each other, essentially what that means. One's action will implicate or affect the other person's action. And then the other party also needs the other person's cooperation. Essentially, that determines or defines interdependence between the two parties or the multiple parties involved. And there is a perceived incompatible goals or goal. There's this perception, the perception that there's incompatible goals, that if one person's goal is met, the other will not be met, and vice versa. So it's a perception. It is something that is perceived even before they communicate. And it is over oftentimes scarce resources. In the example I gave you earlier, if there's only one vehicle at home, but you and your brother would like to use the car and only one person can use it, and both of you are trying to go to two different places, which is the separate goals, different goals, then there is a tension. But it will not be a problem unless there is some kind of interference experienced by the parties. And that's the last element right here, interference. So what that means is that if one party wants to use the car to do something, go somewhere, whereas the other party wants to use the car to go somewhere else, there's a block. The use of the vehicle by one sibling blocks or prevents the other sibling from using it for another purpose. So that's another key word in this definition, is that there are two or more interdependent parties where there's an obvious perceived struggle of incompatible goals. They want different things, and they can only be serviced by a very limited or scarce resource. And when they try to achieve their respective goals over using this limited resource, there's some interference being experienced, that one party's achieving his or her goals interferes or blocks the other person from achieving his or her goals. Alright, so now we have a common definition that we share for conflict. Let's move on to the next slide. So conflict is present when the people involved, the parties involved, their perceptions appear to create a struggle. And that has been expressed either verbally or experienced by the individuals. In the example I gave you earlier, between you and your sibling, it can be something that you say, hey, I want to use the car this evening, and then your brother also say, hey, I want to use the car for something else. So yeah, conflict exists when they have to find a way to agree how that they may use the family car, for example, and that will be a way to resolve or to manage the conflict. And oftentimes we study conflict, we understand that it is a manifestation, and that's the third bullet point here, is some kind of a manifestation of an individual's intrapersonal perception. And let's focus on that term a little bit here. What does intrapersonal perception mean? It means that intra means within the person. The person has some struggle, or the person has some thoughts, and that becomes the foundation where the conflict is built upon. So for example, let's say I have a thought that I need to go to get the grocery tonight. And why do I have to do it tonight? Why can't I do it now or do it tomorrow? Maybe because I'll be busy tomorrow, I won't have the time. Maybe right now I'm studying for an exam, I don't have time to do that, and tonight is the best time. Or maybe tonight there's something special happening at the grocery store. Maybe I'm meeting my friend there. It's an opportunity for us to spend some time together and for me to pick up groceries. So the perception that there is this very narrow window or period of time that this goal has to be achieved by me, for myself, sets up that perception that this grocery shopping has to be done at a specific window or period of time. Whereas at the same time, the perception on the brother's point of view as well, who wants to go out, perhaps he already made plans, or he's meeting other people at that certain time as well, where there is a conflict in time. And so that creates it manifests into the conflict between the siblings. And as we see that conflict can happen when people communicate about their different goals or perception of different goals, there are consequent the communication behavior that happens consequent to realizing what that conflict can also have an impact on the conflict and how it becomes resolved or it becomes worsened. And for the rest of this chapter, we'll be looking at how communication of the conflict participants after realizing there's a conflict can produce either productive or destructive avenues where this conflict would then evolve. And now we return to one of the key components or key variables of the definition of conflict and that is interdependence. The parties are in a conflict reason because they're interdependent or they need the other person or the other people's help in order for them or all of them to achieve their respective goals. Now there's something interesting about conflict, and there's this term called strategic conflict. What strategic conflict means is that the parties actually have options, they have choices other than to be in a conflict with one other person or other people. But somehow the parties choose to be in this conflict, which we define as strategic conflict. Reason because there is somehow some benefit that they can achieve by existing in this in this strategic conflict where there's some kind of tension. So this is a kind of very interesting kind of conflict where the parties deliberately choose to be in a conflict because there's some benefit. As we imagine, in a lot of times conflict usually are unpleasant, and most people choose not to be in conflict with others because we know that not everyone gets out with everything they need or they want. Their needs or their interests will not be met. However, in strategic conflict, that is not the case. And so whether we are looking at the traditional definition of conflict or the more interesting strategic conflict definition, either definitions of conflicts or types of conflict carry some kind of cooperation, a need that the parties involved would help each other in some ways if they want to resolve the conflict. But if not, there is always primarily at the core of a conflict some form of competition, some form of perception that the other party or parties are interfering or blocking the person's pursuit of achieving certain interests or goals. Interdependence also kind of requires or forces the parties to be in such a configuration or position where one depends on the other. And when the parties are not able to achieve what they would like to each independently want to achieve for their goals, they are stuck in a gridlock where one is not able to progress from his or her position because there is this interdependence that cannot be removed. And so when that happens in most relationships, there will be a lot of back and forth of communication where the parties are not able to remove themselves from the conflict or from the interdependent relationship, and that creates a lot of perhaps frustration. So we might wonder, why do people want to be in conflict? Do we like to be in conflict? I think most people would choose not to be in conflict because, as I have alluded earlier, it can be very unpleasant. It's not something that most people would desire to have. However, because the world is such that we're all interconnected, we are all dependent on one another in some way or fashion, conflict is inevitable because all of us have certain goals that we feel are important to ourselves And we try to achieve them oftentimes independently, but it may not always be possible. And so we will have to try to achieve that by some form of communication. However, there will always be other views as to whether those goals are achievable and how those are perceived or framed by other people. So one way that conflicts can be resolved or become easier to resolve or manage is through communication by reframing it and putting it in a different light. If we were to see it differently than where we previously saw, then maybe the tension is not that great, or the dissatisfaction or the feelings of frustration is not that strong, because we finally realize why the other party thinks that what he or she wants to achieve or the grounds that he or she stands on are important to him or her. So the perception of incompatible goals can affect parties from resolving the conflict, but also the perception that there is some incompatibility in the goals can also help when there is a clear dialogue, if that's possible, in expressing each individual's needs and desires. And the interesting thing about goals is that they can be incompatible for both reasons. Both reason that A, both parties want the same thing, or B, both parties want different things. So for example, the example that I gave you earlier about using the family car, two people want to use it at the same time, but there is only one car to be used. So we see that both parties want the same thing, but obviously only one person can use it at that same time. Now, goals can also be, blocked or prevented from being achieved if the parties want different things as well. So for example, let's say, John and Susan, they want to do an activity together this afternoon. They want to spend time together and then to know each other and to spend the afternoon together. But perhaps John wants to go to the library, whereas Susan wants to go to a park for a walk. So they want different things, different ways of getting the same goal. So that can be a cause of tension as well as a cause of their conflict as well. So essentially, incompatible goals, where goals seem to be in tension, they don't overlap, those can be central to all conflicts, but at the same time, if people want the same thing, but that thing is limited, there's limitation to that same one thing, where not everyone can have it together at the same time or be shared by everyone. That also can be a problem or the cause of a conflict. And the cause of that limitation, as we will read from this slide, is the perception that there's this scarce resource, or there's some kind of limitation. There is this very, very small amount, or rather the amount is less than what people wanted. Then that creates that perception of scarce resource, and that also creates or increases that conflict. And two resources that are common in as we study conflict in various contexts, whether it's at home or at work or between friends, is that there's some perception of what power and self-esteem are and how they are perceived and how they are exercised. And we'll look at these two concepts more closely as we progress through the chapters. So with the perceived interference, first of all, there's a perceived scarcity, that the resources that are needed to achieve our goals are limited, the perception that is limited, or perhaps they truly are limited. Apart from that element, the next element is the perception that there is this interference by the other party from our desire or our approach, our attempts to achieve a certain goal. And that perception of interference, if not understood by both parties, can intensify the conflict because they may perceive that why would the other party not be supportive. But oftentimes it can be that perhaps the two parties needed to achieve what they want from a very principled or from a reasonable standpoint, from their perspective at the very least. And when the two how do we say, the two positions or the standpoints are different or radically very different, where they don't overlap, that can, as we've talked about just a few minutes ago, create a lot of negative or unhappiness, negative emotions, such as anger, as we see on this slide. So ultimately, why do we want, or why should people study conflict? The best reason, or a very good reason, is that it improves our mental health and overall happiness, as we see on the first line. It improves our mental health because we become more at peace with the outcome. We improve our mental health because we know that we have more agency to try to untangle the conflict, to untangle the tension. It gives us the feeling that we can actually have an input, whether or not the outcome is what we desire, but at the very least it gives us the sense that we can try to do or try to improve the tension that we see. We see that conflict management of individuals, that the ways that we manage conflict, oftentimes is learned at home. And it's something that we might have observed through our interactions with our family members, or just by watching the elders or the other relatives at home, how they talk about conflict. And many times those are ways that those observations are what socialized us to the constructive or destructive ways of conflict management, and we somehow adopt or learn those approaches, firstly by watching. We see that chosen families, or families that are made up of individuals who are not biologically born, those families may have a different dynamic or different ways of perceiving conflict than, say, biological families. On the previous slide, we have an introduction or a feel for how conflict management in family helps to strengthen relationships. So here we have more or additional details or additional insight into why we study conflict, also again from a family perspective. How individuals grew up learning about conflict and how they may be resolved, the conflicts may be resolved at their families. Those are skills and perceptions that we carry through into other families that we may create in the future, such as with our friends, if there's a way of defining family, as well as perhaps through marriage, and through marriage creating a new family unit. And those can lead to destructive marital conflict if we have learned some of these destructive approaches when we were growing up. So the other next reason why we study conflict is that it helps us to reduce stress. Earlier we talked about mental health, and to reduce pessimism, as I talked about earlier, about growing our agency, knowing that there is some agency that we can have, or we do have, in shaping how the conflict is perceived or be managed. It can be very rewarding, especially if not students, but basically anyone who can manage conflict well. There is a very rewarding sense, because it means that relationships are strengthened, and it also means that the individual's respective goals can also be met, and therefore the sense or the perhaps the reality of the interference is reduced. When we study in conflict, when we know how to be good conflict managers, it also helps with strengthening the family bond and to help benefit everyone in the family to become closer as well. So there's a lot of benefit from studying conflict, first from the family perspective, how we were raised, and as well as how those skills help us to build or strengthen our families. And here we have a continuation of explanation why conflict management is useful for us to learn. It's something we pick up in our family. It's something that we extend into the families that we create in the future, or the families that we have if you are now in a committed relationship or in a marriage. It has some implication to how the marriage would continue. Later on, we'll look at a few concepts, or one big concept that's built on family dynamics. Another context that we study conflict, a big context, will be the workplace. The workplace is a place where many people spend lots of hours every day. Lots of different relationships are at play with colleagues, with clients, with people that we meet at the workplace on a daily basis. So those same skills that we learned, whether it is in the family or in a marital romantic relationship, some of those skills are helpful for us in understanding people's perceptions, and can also help us to identify as well as perhaps avoid and sometimes manage those conflicts that are happening at the workplace. Organizations also depend on leaders who are good conflict managers, because essentially every leader has to be good at that, because essentially everything that's happening at work involves multiple parties, and multiple parties can have different perceptions of how things be done. And when we have those ability to perceive or understand those differences in a transparent way, in a principled way, it helps the parties involved, the co-workers, to build trust and to strengthen the relationships, and hopefully that will reduce feelings that the individuals are in conflict or in tension with one another. And so one more thing that I think is important for us to understand why we study conflict, actually this might not be the last slide about why we study conflict, is that conflict management is a skill. And when we think about a skill, it can be learned, it can be practiced, and it can be something that we become better at or be more proficient in. So therefore, there's another reason, or more practical reason, when we study conflict management, is that it not only benefits the family and the workplace context that we are in, but it's something that we can learn. So some people are naturally good at those conflict management skills, but no matter where everyone is, we can always learn and revise and become even better conflict managers. We also study conflict because when conflicts are unresolved or they are left hanging, there's no satisfying outcome, it affects all parties involved. Because remember, when we said the definition that we had about conflict is that it's between interdependent parties. So when the problem or the conflict is not resolved, the parties are still within that relationship, and it affects all of them. Again, affecting their mental health, affecting their long-term perception or realization or satisfaction of whether they could achieve those goals. So these are all very practical reasons why we have to, or why studying conflict makes a lot of sense. And perhaps one final way to strengthen the argument to why studying conflict management is so essential, so key, is that when we do not understand conflict, we can repeat them over and over again. we may see the same patterns being repeated either in other people's behavior or in our own behavior. In different contexts, it manifests over different contexts, at home or at work or place of worship or communities that we are active in, such as maybe say your community center or some other groups, some non-profit, for example, you might be part of. So by studying conflict from a theoretical standpoint and to improve it practically has this implication of helping us in observing potential conflicts in the future and be better at managing those. So far in the first half of today's lecture on this chapter, we've looked at definitions of conflict, the common definition of conflict, and what are the practical reasons why studying conflict is so useful, or so useful that we should engage in an activity we should engage in. Now we look at how do we prevent destructive conflict. And one of the ways that we can prevent destructive conflict or conflict that doesn't really move forward or help the parties involved to reach a satisfying outcome is that we have to learn to use creativity to explore possible solutions or paths to go forward. And so in order to reduce the chance of the destructive conflict. So again, back to the example that I had, say me and my brother wish to use the family car this evening for different purposes. We happen to want to use the car for different purposes at the same time. You want to use the car at the same time, but obviously only one person can use that because there's only one car. What if we can be creative and say, what if I drove my brother to his event and then I go get the groceries and I can then take the groceries home and at agreed upon time I'll come back and pick him up, for example. That could be one way that we can creatively try to expand or to make it more possible that the scarce resource, i.e. the only vehicle we have at home, more accessible, and to help both my brother and myself achieve the goals that we want to achieve this evening. So that could be just one possible creative outlet, or rather a creative option that we can explore, that my brother and I can explore in order for us to each reach our own goals. The example I provided about my brother and I about using the family car, that is a rather simple example, but perhaps something that you can relate to or you think is possible to happen in a context that you're in. Most conflicts actually have multiple episodes, or rather it takes multiple takes. There are multiple scenarios that after one is completed, it falls into the other and it's a continuation. And perhaps maybe 5, 6, 7 slides ago I talked about a big major research that's been done in families between husband and wife units. That study is actually on this page right now. The study by Goffman, who studied families, married couples, and there are 4 different communication practices that Goffman identified are signs or perhaps predictors where the marital relationship will break down and may even end up in divorce. So the 4 of those common communication practices that came out from this study are listed here: criticizing, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. And those are the 4 different horsemen of the apocalypse, so to speak, that predict the nature and the future of that marital relationship. And even though that research was on families or marital relationships, consequently, researchers find that these 4 horsemen, these predictors, are also indicative of other forms of relationship that you may also observe in other relationships, perhaps in your life, not necessarily in a romantic or a marital relationship. So let's take some time to take a look at them. How conflict can be managed is really dependent on the initial interaction or the very first few interactions. Those are the setup. Those help to set the stage for how the conflict will evolve. So those are critical, this important part. What the study have shown or found is that when the conflict begins with criticism, it is a very, very harsh condition, or the setup is really not gearing the conflict towards a constructive outcome. Criticism is harsh, criticism is hard for individuals to hear, and so when one of these four horsemen, specifically criticism, appears early in that conflict communication, that conflict kind of gets stuck somehow. It's difficult to get out of it, and oftentimes the criticism can be anchored in things like self-esteem as well as power, as we have previewed quite earlier in today's chapter. So one might wonder, how would a defensive climate look like? Here are a few examples provided here on this page. Most pertinently, I think the last one probably is something that we observe quite a bit in a lot of conflict where individuals speak in very defensive language, is that they are presenting a certainty that something or a truth is the ultimate truth, that it is nothing but that possible interpretation. A lot of times when we want to resolve conflict, it is helpful if the parties can take a provisional position, i.e. to say an individual may perceive the reality in a certain way, but the individual is also open that potentially there might be other ways to view that reality. And sometimes that may help, but sometimes it does not. But either way, able to see how the other side sees it helps us to have a better understanding of that conflict. It may or may not help to resolve it, but at the very least, if we are open to seeing that, we become more certain, we can grow in more certainty that why our view is stronger, not because we are certain in the first place, but we become more certain as we have a fuller or better view of that conflict. We probably may never get to 100% view of the entire conflict, but getting a bigger, broader view, a better view, can help us to understand to manage the conflict, and hopefully that also provides insight to the other parties involved. Stonewalling is another of these four horsemen of the apocalypse. In that research into family marital relationships, men tend to stonewall more than women do, and is oftentimes indicate a predictor of a very bad outcome for that relationship. So what happens during stonewalling is that one party would withdraw from the communication and rather be silent and not want to participate. It's a way of avoiding the communication and a way of avoiding that conflict. In this context, in this definition of stonewalling, the conflict avoidance is something that's negative and destructive, because it indicates a lack of interest in wanting to participate or improve the relationship, and that can be very discouraging for the other party that is wanting to communicate. In either way, parties who stonewall may feel that is the appropriate approach, and in some sense, sometimes that maybe they needed some time to be by themselves, to reflect and not say or act in ways that will make the relationship even worse. But sometimes the stonewalling can be the very factor that hinders the conflict from progressing or improving. Contempt is another of the four horsemen, and in this horseman, this description or the description of this horseman is one where individuals feel that he or her is better than the other person. It's a way of putting the other individual down, and that can be very destructive, as we've seen from the other horsemen, that it can be very disruptive and destructive to the quality of that relationship. And it can be a very powerful way that make the individuals disengage, because the recipient of the contempt may read that as a complete denial of their point of view. Having looked at the four horsemen, one thing that's important for us to take away is that although those communication behaviors can be very destructive to the management of conflict, to understand the conflict at hand, we should also recognize that sometimes those responses may be cultural, or perhaps those responses are guided or necessary as dictated within certain rules or regulations or certain expectations that individuals have to portray. So that's important to keep in mind that while those can be disruptive behaviors, sometimes there is this undergirding reason why those individuals have to portray those behavior. Perhaps it's learned, as we have looked at from earlier years in our families, or perhaps it's something that we have somehow felt it was necessary to do or to respond in when we are in that conflict itself. So these are just for the four horsemen are some examples of certain habits that people may portray conflict that is worth studying, but also others that we will pick up in the textbook as well. We find that dominance and subordination can result in destructive conflict. What that means is that oftentimes the dominant group would exercise in ways that suppress the conflict, to minimize it, so as to also to minimize the voice of the subordinate group, the smaller or minority group, and that can help the dominant group extend their power and their voices obviously being heard, and for them to achieve their goals, and by doing so minimizes or reduces the minority group from achieving their goals. Here we see another list of destructive habits extending the ones that we saw previously. These are just a short list of some summary of the habits that we will extend and see more in more depth in the chapter itself. But here gives us some pointers to think about, as we think about the conflict that we may have experienced in recent memory or currently. Reflect on whether you observe any of these habits or tactics being used, and perhaps that might help us realize that the conflict might have entered into a destructive mode. And if it has not, then perhaps we might want to avoid ourselves from using these tactics. And if we identify the other parties using such tactics, maybe we have to learn how to untangle the tension, untangle the conflict, or try to help to move the conflict toward a more constructive setting, such that everyone gets to benefit. On this slide, we'll discuss a little bit about how destructive conflict can spiral out of control. Next slide, we'll look at a diagram or a figure which we have already also seen in the textbook, but here we would like to spend a little bit of time looking at how when conflict are not managed well at the beginning, it can spiral out of control, and the perception makes the conflict even worse, to worsen it and to make the parties feel that the problem is actually much larger and bigger than it really is. And perhaps the problem is really much bigger than they originally thought, but the perception can make it even harder, make the problem even more challenging to be managed. And so in here we see that when a conflict spirals out of control, it can escalate into a lot of negative effects, including effects on individuals' mental health and perception of the other people. And that can really be a downfall that not only hinders them from achieving their own specific goals, but it can have bigger negative implications. Here we can see the example, this figure I alluded earlier in the previous slide about the conflict spiral. This is an example we saw in the textbook about two good friends. I believe they were roommates, Brad and Steve. So we started out well, they want to be roommates, but then as one feels something bad about the other individual feels like, oh no, I have to get back. I have to get back at the my friend. And then there's this tick for tack. There's this challenge between the two. The tension grows. Tension grows beyond what the initial issue may be, and it continues to spiral. As we see here, it continues to spiral. It grows into a bigger problem, where in the end it may mean the friendship has to be dissolved. The friendship no longer exists because there's these all the underlying problem becomes not just the only issue that causes them to be unhappy with one another. It could be something really easy to be resolved in the beginning, but because one party may have expressed it differently, as we looked at intrapersonal communication, they might have kept it in for so long that when they eventually express it, it's in a way that is not very productive, and it becomes a tension. The expression of that initial problem becomes compounded, and then each party tries to find faults on one another, of each other. In this case, between Brad and Steve, and it gets out of hand, and the relationship has to dissolve. Here's another depiction for us on how that conflict can spiral out of hand. It begins with a perception of the other person, right here, perception of the other person, and then based on the perception, it shapes the participants or the party's view or communication behavior, and that shapes consequently the next response. And so it's a reciprocity. It's what the person perceives, what the person gives, and it continues to spiral, as we see from the other slide. It can perceive out of hand. It's perception shaping behavior, and behavior shaping perception, eventually affecting the relationship, and it may come to an end. So the parties may end up very far from the original problem or original tension that they had. It can be very far from it, and it's hard to go back once they have reached that stage. How might we avoid the spiral of those two figures we saw in the previous 2-3 slides? One way is to reduce dependence. In that way, we go back to the definition of conflict. If we can reduce the dependence of the parties, they are less dependent on each other, they need less of cooperation of each other, that can be a way to help to untangle the tension or the conflict. And that is one approach. There might be people feeling unhappy from that, but it helps to alleviate the tension. It helps to lessen the constant feeling that something is not right. It helps them to maybe also gain perspective. The gain perspective of the conflict if the conflict is truly that big as it continues to spiral out of hand, or could we go back to the original point of what was the um, issue or matter that needed to be addressed originally? Here we have a different model as compared to the previous ones that we saw earlier, discussion of the spiraling of a conflict into negativity. Here we also have another way of how the destructive dance can manifest in relationships, and how it may compromise the odds of improving the communication between the parties, and to improve the odds of having a constructive conflict and outcome. So this is just another model for us to consider as we think about a potential use in the conflicts that we experience at work, at school, in school, or at home. Well, we are coming close to today's lecture, and we see how that a spiraling of a negative conflict can result in reciprocity, where a person expresses his or her take or a dissatisfaction, and that may elicit similar or maybe a less strong response emotionally from the other party. What we should look at as well is the next page about retaliation in response to reciprocity. Sometimes the parties may not reciprocate, whether in the same intensity or a lower intensity in terms of emotions, but retaliation can also happen at a later time. So let's take a look at the next slide. So previously we talked about reciprocity and a little bit of retaliation as a preview. Here we have the slide on the retaliation of a destructive conflict. Someone may hold grudges with someone else and feel like, I'm going to hold on to this and then I'll retaliate at a later time. That is also another example of destructive conflict. And in destructive conflict, we find that no one really wins, no one really benefits when something like that explodes, because obviously the person who receives on the receiving end of the retaliation gets a very bad impact that came from the person who did the retaliation. But I also think that when the person retaliates at a later time, they may find some kind of justice or satisfaction, but I think at the end of it, they may also feel a sense of emptiness, that the retaliation, even though it was done and the recipient was hurt, affected in a negative way, but there will be some kind of emptiness. There's some kind of void that feels, so what? So what if I have done that? How did that help to benefit me? How does it benefit me? And I think that is where the person who retaliates may feel some kind of remorse and sadness in having done that, even though they feel like I really want to do it and they plan on it. But after the execution of that retaliation, it is not satisfying, and for a lot of reasons that can create a lot of it continues the sense of emptiness and the sense of not having achieved much. And finally, we come to the last point that we want to discuss from this chapter, is that what is our opportunity when we see conflict, when we encounter conflict. Conflict can be uncomfortable. It can create a lot of negative emotions, make us feel that uneasy. But conflict can also present an opportunity for us to learn, to grow, to become better individuals, as we learn why other people have certain views that may not necessarily align or be similar to ours, and help us to be better communicators. And therefore, conflict management is a skill that we can learn and practice and become better at. It helps us to be individuals who can continue to thrive because we solve problems, we increase agency in improving the quality of our lives. It helps improve our mental health consequently by doing that. And by doing so, the opportunity that we have is truly to recognize signs of destructive conflict, how to minimize that, how to prevent that from happening in the first place, so that we can move conflict more towards a constructive approach, that it makes it more satisfying for all parties involved to resolve that. Ultimately, remember this, that conflict is something is unavoidable because we live in a world that is interconnected. And because of that, and since we live in a world that's interconnected where people depend on one another to quite some extent, then the need to learn how conflict management is done is essential for us in both our personal and professional lives.